I'm going to start the webinar. Welcome everyone to the 2021 New Hampshire voting legislation webinar. My name is Mary Jensen and I'm currently the project manager for the Jonathan Daniels Center for Social Responsibility. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Open Democracy New Hampshire and the League of Women Voters New Hampshire. I encourage you to sign up at all three websites for information related to voting and voting legislation in New Hampshire. I also encourage you to ask questions tonight using the Q&A button. We will answer those at the end. We are recording this presentation, which will be available on the Historical Society of Cheshire County's YouTube channel. I would like to introduce our panelists for this evening's discussion. First, the Honorable Melanie Levesque was the Senator for District 12 from 2018 to 2020 and chaired the Election Law and Municipal Affairs Committee. She was twice a state representative, first from Hillsborough District 26 and later from Hillsborough District 5, in both cases serving on the election law committees. Mrs. Levesque earned her BS from Daniel Webster College and an MBA from Southern New Hampshire University. She is president of the telecommunications services firm TCS of America Enterprises. Bradford Cook is the long-serving chairman for the Ballot Law Commission. He was appointed by Secretary of State Bill Gardner in April of 2020 to chair the Committee on 2020 Emergency Election Support. A lawyer with Shaheen and Finney, Mr. Cook writes a regular column titled Cook on Concord for the New Hampshire Business Review. He is a member of the New Hampshire State Planning Council and has his JD from Cornell University Law School and a BA from UNH Law School. Our host tonight is Jim Rumenier, an historian and author of the book Water Connections, What Freshwater Means to Us, What We Mean to Water, published in 2019. He is the former editor and president of the Keene Sentinel. In addition, Mr. Rumenier is a former select board member in Roxbury, New Hampshire, former president of the Historical Society of Cheshire County, and a graduate of Harvard University. And I'll ask Jim to start.
Thank you very much, Mary. It is fitting that the Jonathan Daniels Center is hosting this program. In 1965, Jonathan Daniels, a young seminarian from Keene, was murdered while doing voting rights work in Alabama. My role tonight is that of an impartial moderator, although as a matter of disclosure, I should say that I did give testimony to Mr. Cook's emergency committee last summer, in which I expressed the view that under the conditions of COVID, an expansion of absentee voting was in order. I'm grateful for the response that the committee and the state made. I asked you to keep your Zoom mute through the program until we get to the question and answer period, and then we'll field your questions. So let's start right away. I'll be running through a couple of questions. We're hoping for some good discussion. The first one is election integrity a problem in New Hampshire today? I leave it to Melanie and to Brad to work out who speaks first and who speaks second and who responds however.
I'll defer to the Senator.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brad. In our election system, we have so many checks and balances. We also have something called a voter checklist. So when you hear about voter fraud, if we were to get 40,000 ballots from China, for example, they would have to have an ID number. So, you know, that does not happen. Or if we got 40,000 ballots from somewhere, the ID wouldn't match, but also if somebody were to use somebody else's ID, which is nearly impossible, there would be duplicate voting. So we have not had these type of problems. Also, our poll workers are just amazing, and we have a very tight process. In addition, I Googled voter fraud in New Hampshire, and I found that there were probably 2 instances of proven voter fraud. So in my view, voter suppression is more of an issue than voter fraud.
I think that's right. Our experience in New Hampshire, for a number of reasons, Melanie hit some of them, but we have a decentralized election system, which is run on the ground by people in local communities, or when it's in cities, in the wards. People know their neighbors. People are very vigilant. And we also have a system in law that balances two goals that we have, which is ease of voting and security of voting. And we got to keep those things in balance, because if you go too far to security, you're going to suppress the vote. And if you go too far to ease, you might have a situation in which voter fraud would be easier to do. But to date in New Hampshire, we haven't seen it. Every once in a while, you hear about the Attorney General's office prosecuting somebody for voting in two places. And I think New Hampshire being New Hampshire, and this is one of the themes I think that we're going to hit on at some point in this discussion. New Hampshire has fashioned its voting rules and regulations to fit New Hampshire. We're largely rural. We're largely decentralized. We have very dedicated volunteers, and we take it seriously. We consistently are in the top 2 or 3 states in voter participation and turnout. And sure, the ideal, if we had Plato's forms on the wall, the ideal is every single voter votes, and every single voter who votes is well informed and educated on what they should do. That's never going to happen, but that would be the goal.
In 2020, some new steps were taken to assure safe and fair elections in New Hampshire, such as the distribution of more than $2 million of federal election-related funds, the expansion of absentee ballot, that in some cases included the installation or use of ballot drop boxes, and allowance for in-person voting that occurred outside of formal polling places. Now, I just touched on some of the changes that were made. How did these and other changes come about? What worked and what did not work?
Well, maybe I'll take that one since I chaired the committee you talked about before. When we went into 2020, and when Secretary Gardner appointed the committee, which was really appointed to advise him on how to spend the federal money that was part of the CARES Act that went to different communities, we quickly realized we had an interesting committee. We had 6 people, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, 3 men, 3 women. But we quickly realized that it wasn't just how to spend the money. We had to look at the whole system, because what we were worried about is that the fear of COVID might keep everybody away from the polls. And the last line of our report said, we better get this right, because the future of the world may depend on it. And literally in a federal election presidential year, with the United States still being the most important country in the world, the fate of the world could have depended on it. So we looked at the whole range of voting, and we said, how are we going to make it possible for people to vote and be safe and not have to sacrifice one for the other? And I think we did a good job, but most of what we did was a reaction to the COVID situation. Luckily, under the New Hampshire Constitution, when an emergency is declared, certain rules can be changed, and both the Attorney General and the Supreme Court recognized that certain things that we couldn't do in a normal year, we could do. And so, for example, we had the no excuse absentee ballot, which wasn't really a no excuse absentee ballot. It was adding fear of COVID-19 to being a disability and a disabling condition that would allow people to vote absentee, even if they weren't sick and weren't out of town and weren't having a religious holiday. It worked well. We had very limited drop boxes after the legislature passed that rule, they had to be attended and supervised drop boxes. We had very creative people in a lot of the communities where they had drive up. I watched the people drive up and cast their ballots in a couple of towns on election day, drive through different voting sites. People could come in person and cast their ballots, absentee ballots early. That wasn't early voting, but it was absentee ballots in person. And it was very controlled and it worked very well. And in fact, we had a record turnout and we're still among the top 3 states in the country for turnout.
Melanie?
Well, first of all, I want to really commend Brad Cook on what a great job that he did in chairing that committee. I listened in on several of the sessions and I felt that you really listened to everyone. I think the folks on the phone, regardless of their role, you could see how much they cared about our voting process. Very knowledgeable, a lot of good critical questions. And I also really commend Senator Tom Sherman, who was our representative from election law, and he showed his skills at being able to work with others and negotiate to find the best solution. So I think that really good work was done on this committee. And things like no excuse absentee ballots are things that we actually advocate for, and I advocate for them. As do many others. I think that the idea of having 8 or 9 excuses of why you can cast an absentee ballot doesn't really respect our right as, eligible voters to be able to cast that ballot. We should be able to make a decision whether to vote absentee or vote at the polls. I also feel like in New Hampshire, we have a very proud tradition of voting, of going to the polls, but it doesn't always fit with everyone's lifestyle. So again, it's a constitutional right that we need to make sure that people have that ability to vote. As far as what worked well, I think the communication was very good, constant communication. Nashua did quite a few things to set up outdoor voter registration, indoor voter registration, and actually voting. And other towns did that as well. And the polling locations were very safe. So these are good things. What were drawbacks, I felt, were that the town clerks, some towns whose clerk was ill, maybe they had COVID, not the clerk, but the supervisor of the checklist, whose job it is to put the names onto the checklist. If they were out, there was no backup plan. So that is a concern to me. I even called the Secretary of State and said, what do they do in this case? But I think that's something that we need to have a backup plan for. And we were able to do all of this during COVID, but part of emergency preparedness is having things like this in place now, so that when it happens again, we're all set. We know what the process is.
I have to agree with Melody on all the points, but on one point, meeting and getting to know Dr. Sherman, who's not only a fine senator, but a very, very talented doctor, was one of the great pleasures of. I still haven't met him in person, but I'm going to meet him in person. But I've met him on Zoom so many times. I feel like he's my friend. But what a magnificent public servant, and it's just for $100 a year. Why he does that is amazing. But what a fine guy.
Brad, you have been involved with the Ballot Law Commission for some years, but I expect that during the hearings of your special emergency committee last year, you may have touched on or been exposed to issues that you had never previously had to deal with. Am I correct in that assumption? And if so—
Oh, absolutely. The Ballot Law Commission, for people who aren't familiar with it, has limited jurisdiction. It is totally a creature of the legislature. There's nothing in the Constitution that says there's going to be a ballot law commission. The state legislature has determined that there should be an appeals process from decisions at the Secretary of State's level on who can be on the ballot, on recounts, on whether people are qualified to run for offices under various statutes or constitutional provisions. And we can only do what the legislature says we can do. People imagine when we're called the Ballot Law Commission that anything that has to do with an election can come to us. It can't. The first question we ask every time we have a case is, do we have jurisdiction over this matter? People ask us all the time, can we clean up elections or design them? The cleaning up of elections is the Attorney General's job, and the design of them is the legislature's job. So we hear challenges to candidacy. We hear challenges to the design of the ballot. We pick the voting machines for the state periodically. We hear appeals from recounts, and that's pretty much what we do. So in the special committee, we looked at every aspect of the design of elections. We heard every issue that there is, and there are many, many issues being debated federally and in states on all kinds of sides of issues for various reasons, with various motivations. But we got to hear it all. And as Melanie said, we had hearings. Sometimes we had 475 people on the Zoom call because every town clerk or city clerk and every moderator and every supervisor of the checklist that could get on them wanted to hear what was going on, wanted their input, and they were very helpful. If I learned anything in it, it's how magnificent our people are who run our elections in New Hampshire. And it's not, I mean, I think the Secretary of State's office does a very good job, but the vast majority of the work is done in the towns and cities and by very, very dedicated and wonderful people, which is the key to safe election. I don't know about other states, but New Hampshire is tremendously lucky to have the people we have.
There are a large number of bills in the legislature this year. Some of them are brand new. Some of them have been in concept on the legislative floor before. Could you mention, both of you, take up some of the bills that are in the Senate and House today that either are worth attention, either because you're supporting them or you don't think they're a very good idea?
Melanie, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Well, there's several bills that were put in place to make permanent these changes that we put in place in 2020. Former Senate President Donna Soucy sponsored Senate Bill 47, which did just that. Unfortunately, the bill was killed. There were also 3 bills to institute independent redistricting. There were actually 2 bills and 1 constitutional amendment, and those did not pass as well. On the bright side, Senate Bill 2, sponsored by Senator Gray, was dealing with pre-processing of ballots, which the towns and cities, mostly cities, have been asking for quite a long time because they get inundated with absentee ballots. And if they can start the process early, supervised and public, but early, then that would help ensure that we don't have long nights the day of the election. And that bill,
Melanie, could you describe the process there, the pre-processing? I understand what it is, but not everyone.
Sure. So the pre-processing allowed a group of people that in public several days before the election, and there's a specified number of days before the election, to actually open the outer envelope. So it prepares the ballot to be counted. They don't open the inner envelope, but it's one step. They also check the name off on a list, but it's one step that helps make the whole process easier. So that's my quick answer to that.
Thank you.
So it is something that was in high demand. So I'm hoping that we can pass that. But there are also several other bills that we've been tracking that make voting harder and disenfranchise some folks. There was one bill on removing same-day registration, and fortunately that bill was killed. There's other bills to choose the electors, the presidential electors. One of those bills suggested that the electors be chosen by executive council district, or if that couldn't happen, then by the senators. Still, other votes were making absentee voting more cumbersome, and there are quite a few bills to prevent college students from voting. One of the bills that did not pass, HB 49, would make all college students eligible for in-state tuition, which would be very, very onerous on our secondary schools. Many of the bills have been retained, so that means they may come back next year. So we don't know if they're going to be passed. So those are some of the bills that I've been keeping my eye on.
Which one?
I think
Go ahead, Brad.
you got two categories of bills, as Melanie said. You've got the proposals to primarily to make permanent some of the changes that we did last year. A little known fact that kind of gets missed in this process sometimes is we were able, as I said before, we were able to do a lot of the things last year because there was an emergency declaration. And there's an emergency declaration provision in the Constitution. When the emergency is over, and all the constitutional provisions that exist in the New Hampshire Constitution, and it is long and involved compared to the US Constitution, come back in force. We have two provisions in the New Hampshire Constitution, Part 1, Article 11, which gives the reasons why absentee ballots can be used. And Part 2, Article 32, that says, except for the ones stated in Part 1, Article 11, voting has to be in person. And there are Supreme Court cases that back up what I'm about to say. And the problem on the absentee ballot one, regardless of one's opinion of no fault absentee ballot, no excuse absentee ballot, is we'd have to change the Constitution to do it. And so a lot of the discussion, as good as it is, and as good as the arguments are on both sides, has some constitutional problems. I absolutely think that the pre-processing proved to be really successful and helpful, and was especially necessary when the number of absentee ballots tripled or quadrupled. But I think that's something that could be made permanent. I think the properly supervised drop boxes, I've never understood the objection to them. I understand the objection to just putting a box out on the street someplace and having people be able to drop their ballots in them, and then somebody can come and carry the thing off. But that's not what we're talking about. Absolutely agree that the neutral commissions doing redistricting would solve a problem. I mean, I guess the rationale for not having it is I hope my party's in control in the year of the census or the year after the census so that we can draw the districts. But why wouldn't everybody feel more comfortable if there was a neutral commission doing it? So if your party happened to get wiped out in one of these wave elections, you'd still get a fair shake. I don't get it on that one, but I'm a Republican and I guess my party, I guess it's my party and I can cry if I want to, but you know, there's two categories of bills, and the people that worry me the most are the ones that think there was fraud in that election and that somehow the election was stolen last year. Mm-hmm. And they put in all these bills to make it harder to vote, thinking somehow they're going to keep the people who stole the election from stealing another one. Well, it wasn't, and they don't need them. And the Supreme Court of the United States has said that college students can vote. I don't happen to agree with that. When I was in college, I had to get an absentee ballot from the state where I lived to vote. And I did it, and I think it's okay. But the Supreme Court has said they can vote, they can vote. So I think when we talk about election, when we talk about our system in New Hampshire, and Melanie will laugh when I say this because she must have heard it 8 million times in the legislature. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. because our elections work pretty well and we have a pretty good balanced system in New Hampshire. So before we pass all kinds of tinkering, we should appreciate what we got because it's pretty balanced and it's produced pretty good results.
On the matter of absentee voting, you raised the constitutionality issue that Mr. Scanlon of the Secretary of State's office has repeatedly reminded us of. Yet, while the Constitution does specify certain categories of people who can qualify for an absentee ballot, such as someone who's going to be out of state, there are categories that are established by law, not by Constitution. For example, conflicts with religious services or conflicts with people taking care of elderly relatives or children and such. So I've been a bit, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a bit confused by the argument that it's got to be in the Constitution if one wants to change the rules when it comes to who qualifies for an absentee ballot.
It's not those. It's a combination of the two constitutional provisions. It's not just Part 1, Article 11 that has the list of who can do it. Those were put in. I think there's too much in the New Hampshire Constitution. They happen to be there. It's the other one that says voting has to be in person. That's proven to be the problem in the Supreme Court cases, and that's Part 2, Article 32. And you're absolutely right that there are some categories that are put in by statute, and I guess they've never been challenged.
On this topic, Melody has been temporarily offline. We expect that she'll be back. At this time of political polarities, it is worth noting that there was a bill in a committee in the House, an elections committee, House Bill 555, that passed 20-0, which is to say unanimity. This is a provision that clarifies a matter involving absentee ballots. That is, somebody who is awaiting trial who's incarcerated in his or her community can qualify for an absentee ballot. So happy to see that, even more happy to see 20-0.
Well, last time I checked, you were innocent until proven guilty. So regardless of the merits of the convicted felons can or can't vote, that's a thing that varies by state. Taking the vote away from somebody who hadn't been convicted yet seems a little unconstitutional to me, and I guess the committee was fairly well persuaded.
Well, we await Melanie to come back because I know she wants. Oh, good.
Sorry about that.
Welcome back.
Enter your participant.
All right.
Melanie, there are laws and rules regarding campaign finance. Are the current practices and law in New Hampshire what you think they ought to be, or can they be improved?
I think that they can be improved. I think that there's too much money in politics at just about every level. A testament to that is how we had a special election race and at least $32,000 was spent on a reps race when it's typically less than 500 to about 3,000. There's a lot of money in politics, and many times it comes from outside influence. We've been trying for several years to pass a bill to state that, to overturn Citizens United, basically, and to limit the amount of funds that come in from outside and from others, and also to have disclosure. If we had disclosure, that would be huge, and at least understanding who is funding the campaigns.
I think a number of years ago, I chaired a different committee that was set up by the legislature on trying to come up with public funding of elections. Yeah. It was called the Granny D Commission, and we had the privilege of having Granny D come there, and I got some of the dearest pictures I've ever seen in my life. It was just a fun commission, and it had interesting people, John Rao and Jim Rubens, who probably don't agree on anything politically, but they both agreed on campaign finance reform. And we came up with a system that, it's just a trial system to try to come up with public financing if people elected it. It's a very hard subject. But I think the Supreme Court of the United States blew it big time when they decided Citizens United, because they opened the floodgates. I mean, you talk about the Merrimack election you were just talking about. No, that was a Trump versus Biden exercise by people who might want to run for president in the next election, and they always can come in with money. But look at Tom Sherman's reelection campaign for the state Senate last year. His opponent said he was going to spend $250,000 of his own money to get elected in the state Senate that pays $100. And Tom had to go out and match him. He didn't do it with his own money, but he got a lot of contributions. $500,000 for a New Hampshire state Senate election. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. When I was involved in this kind of stuff in the 1960s and 70s, people ran for the state Senate with a budget of, $500 or $1,000. When Senator Rodman ran for the United States Senate, he was my law partner, so I was very involved in that campaign. He said, in this campaign, in the primary and general election to get elected to the United States Senate, I think I'm going to have to spend $600,000, and we were all horrified. That was 1980. When Kelly Ayotte and Maggie Hassan ran against each other, $17 million got spent. Now, there's been inflation since 1980, but not that much. It is infectious. It's both positively bad and negatively bad. It deters a lot of people from running for office. Why would anybody in the world want to be a first-term congressman? Because you spend half of your life on the telephone trying to raise money so you can be a second-term congressman.
Yeah.
It's nutty.
So how to fix that?
Get the Supreme Court, get a constitutional amendment or get the Supreme Court to reverse itself on Citizens United. I think that's about all you can do on federal elections anyway.
Yeah, and we could do things, and we've tried to do things within proposed bills within the state as well. But unfortunately, we weren't able to pass those bills, but we can do something at a state level as well. As a matter of fact, there's another bill that's being sponsored, I believe it's HB 263, that says that it moves the amount that you would have to file based on, like, originally it was $500. Currently it's $500. So anything over $500, you would have to file. So it's going to change that to $1,000. Also, it doubles the amount that people can donate from $5,000 to $10,000. So if you want to win a race and you have 10 people that will donate $10,000, that's okay. And that's not okay. We need to have voters chosen by the people, not by people with big money, So Brad, I like your comments that you expressed as well. Especially pointing out that for a state Senate race, you have to raise $250,000.
That's crazy. That's crazy. Even in Hampton and Rye, that's crazy.
And might I also add that gerrymandering has something to do with this, because the harder and uglier we need to fight, the more we need to rely on money from outside, the more we're going to get more gerrymandering. We're going to have less people working together to create good law. So I think gerrymandering ties into money and politics as well.
It's hard to gerrymander 400 House seats, but when you have 2 congressional seats, and when you have, it's really hard to gerrymander the United States Senate seats because they're the whole state. So that's safe. But look at what happened in our executive council districts 10 years ago. They drew a couple of districts that could flip, a couple of very safe districts for the Republicans. 3, I think, were safe for the Republicans most of the time, although it hasn't always been that way. And then there's that funny district that has Concord and Portsmouth and Keene, I guess, or almost all of those things in it. Every Democratic town they could find, they put in the same district. it was a safe Democratic place, but they threw all the Democrats in there that might have made the other districts equal. And that's just pure gerrymandering. And it's, it's just wrong. And I don't get it.
And I'd just like to add, as a state representative, we have gerrymandering in the state Senate, state representative races as well. When you take towns that have a lot of commonalities and you split them up and you create a flotario with towns that do not have commonalities, that's part of gerrymandering. So we have it at all levels.
Yep, that's fair.
Yeah.
We have been discussing election and voting matters in New Hampshire through and involving the New Hampshire legislature and the Constitution. If we can move here to something of national consequence, that is HR 1. It is titled the For the People Act, which would make a large number of changes to election law. Could both of you speak to that particular matter? This is federal law that would apply to states.
Well, I'd like to talk about that because I'm pretty passionate about the For the People Act. I think that many of the components that are in the For the People Act are things that states are already doing and they're working well. There's even paper ballots, which is something that we champion. Same-day registration, also something that we have. A lot of other things like automated voter registration, which is something that I worked on when I was a senator. That's just the first step to get into the voting process. And it makes it easier for people to get into that two-step process. Things like the no excuse absentee balloting, the independent redistricting commissions, and getting money out of politics and having strong ethics rules. All of these are important components to a strong democracy. And I understand that this is happening at the federal level. However, if we have the will, we can adopt those standards as well. So unfortunately, today there was an amendment made to Senate Bill 89, and it was a proposal to prevent New Hampshire from adopting any of the HR 1 or S1 components should they pass. And that bill, that amendment did pass. So that is pretty concerning to me. Another thing I would mention is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is up for reauthorization. That's HR 4. And as far as that Voting Rights Act in 1965, Jonathan Daniels, thank you very much for fighting so hard for people that are unlike him, but yet like him. We're part of the human race. And he cared so much that he would go down south and help people realize these voting rights. And in 1965, the voting suppression was against, it was about literacy tests, it was about poll taxes, and there was a requirement for pre-clearance of any voting laws that might be discriminatory. But in 2021, there's a difference between 1965 and 2021, and that is that in 65, we were trying to help Black people in the South and Black people in the North realize those voting rights. But in 2021, it's not just Black people who are being discriminated against or losing their rights. It's people of color, it's disabled, it's poor people, it is college students. And because of gerrymandering, it's even people that live in these, middle or upper class towns, Hollis, Brookline, that value their schools. They value things like climate change. And all these folks are going to be disenfranchised as well due to gerrymandering. So I think it's really important that we pass HR 1, that we recognize that we need to have a strong democracy. And when we look at the TV and we see map of the United States, 43 states have voter suppression laws, and New Hampshire is one of them. I think that's a problem. So we're going to need our federal government to help us out here and maintain our democracy.
Well, I agree. passionate about HR 1 too. I think it's one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. It's 600 pages of federal legislation that every idea that anybody's ever had about elections, good, bad, or indifferent, has been put into. When I knew I was going to get involved in this event tonight, I made the mistake of bringing it up on the screen on a Saturday morning, and I started through it. About halfway through Saturday afternoon, I started skimming, because it is everything. There's something in there that everybody can salute, for sure. There's a lot of good things, a lot of good ideas in there that every state probably should adopt. But there's all kinds of stuff that's bad for New Hampshire, inconsistent with some of the advantages we have in New Hampshire. Doesn't fit New Hampshire, probably fits some places, doesn't fit here. But fundamentally, I think it's going to apply, most of its provisions can only apply to federal elections. Now, what are federal elections? The election for congressman and senator, not the election for presidential electors. Those are state officials. Interestingly, I didn't know that till yesterday. So either people are going to try to apply it to states and the Supreme Court's going to find it's unconstitutional, or states are going to have to adopt two systems, one for federal elections, one for state election, or somehow people are going to say, well, it got passed, so we ought to adopt all of its provisions. If there are good ideas in that bill, and I'm sure there are, because I read some and I said, yeah, it's a good idea. I think we should have, as I said before, I think to avoid gerrymandering. And I'm surprised that some Supreme Courts that we've had haven't made that a requirement, very frankly, as a constitutional right. But this bill should not pass. And this bill fundamentally interferes with states designing the system for their own citizens. I think it's a reaction, it's an understandable reaction to the Trumpians' attempts in a lot of legislatures to tighten rules and some of the rhetoric that's been going on. But 600 pages of anything can't be a good thing. And so I fundamentally object to it on a whole number of bases. And that's why it's nice to have a discussion like this, because we were agreeing on everything up till now. So, you know.
Well, there's a lot in that bill. Brad has pointed out a couple of good things in it, including particularly the reference to independent redistricting commissions. Melanie, can you find anything in the bill that you don't like?
I haven't found anything that I don't like, no. I found things that, I found things that I really do like and I think that are very important. And I also feel like if we have the will to make the change to ensure that everyone has the right and the freedoms to vote, then we could adopt those policies. And I also feel that 600 pages, I mean, legislation like this it's hefty, it's big, and I'm sure it's not the only 600-page bill that has been about. This is huge. These folks in Washington have a full-time job, and that is to read this legislation, to work on this legislation.
So here's a few examples of what the federal government shouldn't be telling New Hampshire. Internet registration and modification. We have a principle in New Hampshire that we're not going to have any part of our election process be hackable. Automatic registration. We have same-day registration. Don't need it. No limits on absentee voting. Prohibition on restrictions on convicted people voting. That's been a matter that states have decided state by state over the years. Forcing expanded voting time. Allows portability of registration. You move in a town and you're registered, or a city in New Hampshire wouldn't be a town. You know, your registration is portable to another polling place. Think of the confusion that can do. We don't need it. We have same-day registration. Requires motor voter. We don't need it. We have same-day registration. Requires accepting applications from people under 18 years old. What's the federal government doing that for? Requires early voting. Requires prepaid postage for return envelopes. We had more chatter on prepaid postage on absentee ballots at our special committee last year. We put it in. Secretary of State didn't like it. Governor didn't like it. Didn't happen. I made a facetious offer to pay the postage for anybody that said they couldn't vote because they couldn't come up with the money for prepaid postage. If you require, and we also had enough testimony to tell us how complicated the postal rules are and how complicated it is to implement prepaid postage. That's a huge expense being put on people. Requires every higher education institution to designate an election official. Dictates rules on polling place design. Requirements for websites of election officials. What's the federal government telling every state about that stuff for?
And I would respond by the comment that I made that we have 43 states that are putting laws in place to suppress our voters. I feel like sometimes our states are not working on our behalf, and someone needs to step in here. Things like automated voter registration, which again, I've been an advocate for, are things that will modernize, streamline, make work easier and faster and save money. And so those are things that we should be looking for. I understand that the Secretary of State was even looking at some form of internet registration. So it is not impossible. When it comes to felons being able to vote, this does differ in many states. There are very few that don't let people vote after they've served their time. But this should be the law of the land, the law of our country, that after you have served your time, then you can vote.
There are ancillary or secondary considerations that can be attached to voting. Two examples here. Secretary of State Bill Gardner, testifying against H.R. 1 in Washington, said that among other things, it would, if that law were passed, it would put in jeopardy New Hampshire's first in the nation presidential primary. A completely different consideration has to do with the discussion regarding college students voting in New Hampshire. Some people who support college students, out-of-state college students voting in New Hampshire say, please let that happen. That will help cement their allegiance to New Hampshire, and they'll stay in the state after they graduate. That's for the benefit of New Hampshire. So should such ancillary secondary considerations be a part of discussions about the act of voting, who gets to vote?
Sure, why not? I mean, if those things are true, and there's an unintended effect by some change or benefit of some change, and I'm not sure either of those things is true. There's a college student, if I have this one right, there's a college student running for selectman or a town office in Hanover who refused to pledge that he would serve out his whole term because he'd be done with school before the term was up. That's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure I'd vote for that candidate if the candidate said that, but that people of Hanover have the right to elect him and he has a right to run. But sure, if in fact college students voting cemented them to the process in the state and it was going to keep them here, that would be a nice ramification. Whether it's an argument that carries the day for passing it, I don't know. I'm not sure, because I haven't discussed it with them, why HR 1 threatens the New Hampshire primary. Mr. Gardner knows a lot more about the New Hampshire primary than I do. And he's been very good at championing it and protecting it over the years. I didn't find anything in the HR one that said New Hampshire can't be first and can't pass a law that says it can be first. But maybe there's something there, and I haven't talked to Bill about it, so I don't know anything.
So regarding college students being able to vote, first of all, the 26th Amendment gives anyone 18 or older the unabridged right to vote. It doesn't say where you must be when you vote. For almost 10 years, college students in New Hampshire have been able to vote on campus. They can vote on campus or they can vote at home. They just can't do both. And we know that that's happened before. I won't tell you who it was, but anyway, so, I've heard college students testify on why they should be able to vote in New Hampshire. And it makes a lot of sense to me that many of them are more vested in where they live on campus for up to 4 years, rather than they are at their homes, which they've been under their parents' wing. They do what their parents do. Now they're adults. And I think that we need to treat them like adults, in addition to the fact that many of them will stay in New Hampshire. We want to make this state welcome to our young people. We are a graying state. Just had my hair done, so I'm not. But, but we are getting older, and we need these young people, and we need them to be engaged. Because if we don't have that full engagement, if democracy is not something that we do, then it is something that we will not have. And that's Granny D. Sideways.
Thank you. We're drawing near the end of our program, so we'd like to turn to some questions that have been turned in. I'll start with one from Liz Tentarelli, who's the head of the League of Women Voters in New Hampshire. Here's her question. So much of election law in the past few years has been supported by the argument that we, quote, need to prevent fraud, close the quote. The Attorney General's office has investigated, found few examples in the past election cycles, and prosecuted them. Literally just a handful of bad actors or dumb ones who voted twice. But we keep hearing it's widespread. How do we convince people that voter fraud is extremely rare? And how do we translate that into change of attitude among legislators?
Well, I think we started with that question from you. I think we can share the facts with people and show them that there haven't been a lot of instances of voter fraud. And I think it's that balance that I talked about before. We have safeguards in a lot of our statutes that prohibit or discourage, nothing prohibits, but we have criminal laws that prohibit ballot fraud or election fraud, but that's why they get prosecuted. But I think it's preserving the balance, looking at every proposal, not because of the motivation, because we know where some of these things come from. People want to keep young people from voting because they think old people will vote better or in their party or something. But what is the possibility of real fraud, real interference, real hacking, Russian interference with elections? What things that we might institute to make things easier that are going to make them more susceptible to fraud, and which things are just going to, because they're advertised as discouraging fraud, are really to suppress votes. And I think every proposal ought to be looked at through that lens, because a lot of these proposals in these 13 pages that we have in front of us, all of us, are blatant attempts to suppress votes by people who think voting was stolen last year, don't want to have voting. And that's just wrong. But opening things up so that the Russians can hack it, whenever we have a machine study for new voting machines at the Ballot Law Commission, we have two rules. The machines can't be networked because networks can be hacked, and every voter gets a ballot. So you can check the machine and you can have a verification And we have a lot of towns in New Hampshire that don't have machines at all and just use vote. And those are the kinds of hard and fast rules that really ought to be the black letter law of elections.
Thank you. We have a question from Gabrielle Watson. How much of the increase in voter turnout in 2020 can be attributed to the expanded categories of reasons that people could use for an absentee ballot? For the record here, in the 2016 election, about 10% of the total vote was absentee. In the 2020 presidential election, about 32% of the total vote was absentee. Over 75% of Granite State voters voted in 2020. I'm not familiar with any number, any estimate as to how many of those, to what extent expanded absentee balloting contributed to the total turnout. Have either of you have?
I think the answer is we don't know how much of the total number of voters, absentee and non-absentee, was due to the change in the absentee ballot rules. But we sure as heck know that the fact that there were 2 to 2.5 times as many, or 4 times, whatever it was, absentee is because of the change in the rules. I've never voted absentee in my life except when I was in Europe one time. But I voted both elections last year absentee because I didn't want to go to the polls with all the COVID stuff going on. And I like to vote in person, and I'm kind of an election nerd. But I voted absentee, and I went and watched elections anyway. But certainly the change in the rules accounted for the incredibly larger number of absentees. But remember last year, all across the country, Joe Biden got more votes than any person that ever ran for president. The second most votes of anybody that ever ran for president was President Trump's vote last year. Now that drives me crazy, but that's a fact. And so this was a very passionately fought election, a national presidential election. So all we really know is the increased number of absentee ballots was due to the change in the rules on absentee ballots.
Melanie, do you have thoughts on the role that absentee ballots played in the turnout last year?
Well, I think that without the absentee ballots, we would have had a dismal election. I don't have the numbers either, but it really helped a lot of people get into the process and vote. I just want to say one real quick thing about the election fraud and machines and modernization is that we shouldn't be afraid of modernization because it is tight, it is secure. We bank online, we shop online. There's a lot of things that we do online, but I also want to put in a word for post-election audits because we should always have some form of auditing the work that is done. Thank you for letting me say that.
Now a sociology question. According to Pew Charitable Trust polling, the percentage of people who have faith in the accuracy of voting in their own states is in the high 60s. Their faith in the accuracy of voting in other states is in the 30s. Why do you think that is?
It's the same reason that you like your congressman, but you think Congress is terrible. I mean, the less you know about something, the more you suspect.
I think it's that concept of that belief that fraud is happening elsewhere or problems are happening elsewhere, but believing in it in your own state, you actually see what is happening.
What I think is sad in the last election is reading about politicians in states like Georgia, where they did such a magnificent job of having a fair election with Republican officials running the show and getting pounded for it, that people in their own state are trying to sow doubts about it. In New Hampshire, the Republican state chairman never pounded on the state election and said this has to be wrong because his candidate didn't win the presidential election. And I think, you know, if I was one of those guys in Georgia, I'd be really ticked off.
Well, thank you very much. Our hour is up. I thank our panelists for shedding light on these issues today. I thank the Jonathan Daniels Center for Social Justice in Keene for organizing this event. Clearly, there's a lot more to talk about. There's plenty going on in the legislature. There's plenty of discussion about the accuracy and integrity of voting. So this one panel discussion won't end the debate. There's much to debate, much to work on. So thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you, Jim.
Jim.
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you, Mary. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes, indeed. Been fun.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Melanie. It's always good to